African people from the Caribbean contributed to the greatness of America. DJ Herc, the father of hip hop, he is of Jamaican origin.
And by the way, you said Dr. Herc started rap. You know he didn't. And Marcus Garvey,
he's the father of hip hop, my brother. He's the father. He's recognized, universally recognized. He's the father. He's of Jamaican ancestry. You have an issue with Africans.
Father of hip hop.
You have an issue with Africans who are not born in America. You are a tribalist and you are part of the division amongst African people.
I actually don't.
You have an issue with Africans not born in America.
What I have an issue with is what's happening right now.
And you are part of the
division right now is when people
I'm going to pray for you to grow past that.
So do you still feel that reparations in America is for all African people?
Well, for me, coming from a Pan-Africanist standpoint, and I offer no apologies, just as I've said in my message in Jamaica, just as I said in my message in Guadeloupe, just as I said in my message in Ethiopia, just as I said in my message in South Africa, and just as I'll say in my message this weekend in Barbados and next week in the U.S. Virgin Islands, there was one slavery that took African people from one continent and scattered us all around the world. And because there was one slavery, there should be one organized reparations movement. And even if Negroes are still in love with being separate from one another instead of operating as a single race, we should still at least collaborate and communicate with each other so that the white power structures of the world who we're going to for these reparations cannot play the divide and conquer, separate and rule tactic, because there's no collaboration amongst the figures and no collaboration amongst the demands. So for me, I will never agree with any of the movements until we have one organized global reparations movement. I think that would be the most effective and it would be most comprehensive. But to your point, as it relates to the American African situation, the truth of the matter is African people from the Caribbean contributed to the greatness of America. DJ Herc, the father of hip hop, he is of Jamaican origin. When we go to nationalism, Marcus Garvey, the greatest Black organizer of all time, who built the movement from New York City, he was of Jamaican origin. When you look at the Harlem Renaissance, many of the writers and the poets and the actresses and actors of the Harlem Renaissance, they came from across the Caribbean. They came from even from Africa. So my point is, you cannot delineate where Blackness begins and where Blackness ends. Even in the Civil War, many of the soldiers who fought in the Civil War for African people to be free, many of them came from the island of Haiti. They were brought here by the slave masters when they fled Haiti, and many of them ended up in the war. There were even Africans in the Civil War from Africa who were here. So for me, we have to be very careful about this definition of what an American African is, because there are no true demarcations. Just as we contribute to African culture today, African culture contributes to us today. And trying to separate who is Caribbean African versus who is an American African is a slippery slope, because in the transatlantic slave trade, most of our ancestors were taken from Africa to the Caribbean islands. That's where you were broken. And after you were broken, quote unquote, in the Caribbean islands, you were then brought to the colonies. Only about 25% of Africans came directly from Africa to the United States. Most of our ancestors came from the Caribbean islands. Even the vessel that showed up in Jamestown, Virginia on August the 20th, 1619, that vessel was en route from a Caribbean island. So we just have to keep in mind that, you know, for me, I don't have an issue with folks delineating, because if the Caribbean is going to delineate and if the continent is going to delineate, I don't have a problem with the American African delineating. I'm simply saying there are no sure dividers when it comes to dictating or determining or defining who is an enslaved, who is a descendant of an enslaved African in America versus someone who should be excluded because they have African or Caribbean ancestry, particularly Caribbean ancestry, because slavery started there longer before we got here. So many of us came directly from those parts. So what makes me a, American African versus a Caribbean African when I got roots from the Caribbean?
Now, I will say that I'm not so familiar with some of the stats you mentioned about there being a lot of Caribbean or African soldiers in the Civil War. but I'm from South Carolina. I know you know the Gullah Geechee people, and our system of slavery that was established here in South Carolina was pretty much transported from Barbados until they realized that small island couldn't keep up with the large demand for the rice plantation. But the thing with reparations, the debt in America, at least, the debt starts with the end of slavery. And the majority of those people, as I said, as data does support, were third, fourth, fifth generations. Most of them came from really domestic, sadly to say, breeding farms. Virginia and Maryland, where Miss Giselle is from. And then after that, you will have, as I know you know, a century of government-sanctioned terrorism. And by the time the immigration bill was written in 1965, the immigrant population of America, even though I know you cited that some in the Harlem Renaissance, the immigrant population of Black America was still was less than 1% in the time. And then there was a study.
Disagree with that. I would disagree with that, but continue.
Okay. Well, then there was a study just done by the Pew Research Center saying
that's
that
totally inaccurate. There was way more Africans in here than 1%. In fact, I would even have to challenge how they came up with those numbers. But continue.
Well, we have to look at the research, and then there was the one done the Pew Research Center saying that over 50% of Black immigrants in the country came in after the year 2000. After the Immigration Act, there was a big wave. So
only 3% of American Africans are immigrants. Only 3%. So you're not even dealing with a whole bunch of people. My issue with the reparations piece, and again, that's not my fight. I'm gonna let y'all fight that because that's not important to me at all as a Pan-Africanist. But my issue with reparations, folks, is how we would go out of our way to castigate 3% of African immigrants. 3% of us in this country are African immigrants. They're not as large as these other group of immigrants that are here. But be that as it may, we will go out of our way to castigate that small 3% of our number in this country who immigrated from the Caribbean, Central South America, or Africa, but we say almost nothing about the Latinos who have been raping your civil rights. You say nothing about the LGBTQ who have been raping your civil rights. We don't say anything about the groups who are really responsible for eating from the plate of Black America because we're scared of them. So we don't want to upset the homosexuals. We don't want to upset the women's movement. We don't want to upset the Latinos. So we're going to pick on the African immigrants because they're the only people we're going to get away with by targeting them. Why are you not targeting the real people who have siphoned off of the civil rights movement? Why are we attacking African immigrant brothers and sisters? That's just my position. But again, that's not my fight. I'm going to let y'all have that because as a Pan-Africanist, I wouldn't even waste my time on that.
Let me push back. If you probably not that familiar with me, no one called out the Mejorando la Raza gang among a lot of Hispanics who a lot of times classify as white, even if they are Black. Asian Americans, white women, the ones who are anti-Black. Of course, the LGBTQ movement, all of those groups get called out. But what has not historically happened in America, we as Black Americans have not called out those who look like us, but oftentimes will work against us all the same, who are Black Americans, freedmen, or FBA, as you will sometimes call American
Clarence Thomas
African.
has done more to work against Black people than any immigrant you can name.
Or
Candace Owens has done more to work against African people than any immigrant that you can name.
Candace Owens is not one of us. She's from the Caribbean. Now, Clarence Thomas is from Savannah, Georgia. I don't know a whole lot about him legislatively, but I do know, and I was going to get to this point, but we're running out of time.
You don't know a whole lot about him. You don't know what just happened with affirmative action and higher education.
And I agree what just happened with affirmative action.
What are you talking about?
I agree what just happened with affirmative action. He pretty much made it clear that freedmen, which is a status that's held by the descendants of American slaves, is not racial, it's based on lineage. And now these other groups, like those immigrants you just mentioned, but even including some Black immigrants, cannot just come in the country and say American racism has hurt them directly. But let me continue real quick. I think the issue is that we're now calling out even Black immigrants who come here, and you've done this before, and have an anti-Black American mindset. You've called them out in some of your videos. That has not always historically been the case.
I call everybody out in my videos. I might call out African immigrants who work against African people because that is true. They exist.
Exactly.
Just like you got American Africans who work against immigrants. The bottom line is, as a race, because I deal with us as a race. For me, this is a chessboard, not a checker game. As a race, we play too much tribalism with one another. The white man doesn't like each other all the time, but they know how to organize as a group to keep us on the bottom. Irish think they're better than Italians. Italians think they're better than Jews. Jews think they're better than Greeks. But when it comes to the future of white supremacy, they can call a time out to the petty differences that they have and work on what is universally in the best interest of white people. Chinese don't necessarily like Japanese. Japanese don't necessarily like Vietnamese. Vietnamese don't necessarily like Cambodians. But when it's come time to talk about what is in the best interest of Asian people, they can call a timeout to the petty differences and take care of business for the race. My issue with us as African people, not just you and the American African, but our people around the world, is we are so pettily committed to our tribal agenda that we cannot see the larger picture. And because of that, we will perish if we don't get over it. I don't have a problem with y'all fighting. Y'all fight how y'all want to fight it. That's for y'all to do. But for me, I'm about the liberation of all African people and the complete solidarity of all African people. I do not do tribalism, and no matter what name or banner it comes under.
Well, if Dan we're running out of time, let me say real quick, the lineage issue is not the same as tribalism, but I do agree with tribalism being an issue, like you was just in Ethiopia, with having severe ethnic conflict. That is an issue, but I support Pan-Africanism to the extent where we all get the resources we're owed, the money we're owed from respective oppressor. Mrs. Zell, you had your hand up. I know you want to respond to something.
Yeah, no, I actually, when it comes to reparations and everything here, we know by law that it can't be race-based. We already know that. We know that if we do anything race-based, it's going to fall through. That's already been determined. It's already been, like, this has already been discussed and thrown out 50 billion times for that purpose. But the biggest issue that I see is the people who are brought to this country, who look like us, they work directly against us. We've been, and not all of them, because we have some major riders with us that are here that do not go against what we're doing. That's why certain things were able to get pushed through, even with the Reparations Task Force in California. But we can't deny the fact that, one, we're the only group. They didn't say Africans, they didn't say Caribbeans, they said Black Americans specifically.
I'm not a Black American, I'm an African, and homosexuals, women, and Latinos have done way more harm to Black people than African immigrants. But go ahead, my sister.
I don't deny that, but I will say this much. When we're in this fight and people are coming into the schools that our ancestors built, and they're doing things like Africa Takeover Day at Howard University. We have even some of the ones
Howard University was built by white people, not Black people.
We know it was built by them, but we're talking about those who are going there.
It was built by
African people.
Built by Black Americans, actually.
They paid
Howard
for
University was started by white folks. It was not a private Black school.
It was built by slave labor.
All of those institutions were. But we have African groups going to our schools doing that. And then when you go to even the people that's trying to take away Black History Month, like they're saying, you don't need to be just a Black American History Month. We celebrate the Caribbean all the time. I've never had a time where in Baltimore where people didn't go all over the place to celebrate the Caribbean festivals. I never had a time where we didn't celebrate African traditions. We were even doing Kwanzaa for a long time, especially in our churches, wearing the kente cloths, learning the history and all of that. We have museums like the Black and White museums here in Baltimore, made specifically.
I'm sorry to cut in,
but just to clarify, good brother, Howard University was established March the 2nd of 1867. There was not slavery in the country when Howard was established. It was not built by slave labor.
What, slavery still existed in the form of
1867.
Sharecropping.
My dear brother.
Still existed.
My dear brother.
Hold on, Dr. Umar, let me say this real quick. No, we got to
My
move
dear
on.
brother, March the 2nd, 1867, slave labor did not build Howard.
Sharecropping was still a big thing. It was pretty much like a second
I
form of chattel slavery.
I understand that, brother.
But,
no, I'm with you on that. But Howard University was not built with slave labor. It wasn't established until March 2nd, 1867.
Are you talking about Howard or Harvard?
Howard. Black Howard, D.C.
Mrs. L, you mentioned Howard or Harvard.
She said Howard.
I mentioned Howard. Morgan State University was built by Black people, and it's a lot of immigrants that's taking over that school also. But it's not.
Well, let me just say,
if y'all want to keep picking on the immigrants, y'all can keep picking on the immigrants. When y'all going to get at the Latinos, the homosexuals,
all of them? Absolutely.
They're the ones hustling Black folks. They're not going to attack them, though. They get a pass, though. They get a pass.
Nobody gets a pass.
They get a pass.
Give Dr. Umar the last word. Pretty much everyone's going to get
called
out.
No. First of all, let me say this to the listening audience. As you said when we started the interview, we can agree to disagree. So we are all passionate, but this is all in love. I want to make that very clear. You understand me? I want to be clear about that. As a Pan-Africanist, we are about unity. We can disagree. We disagree within the Pan-African movement at times. You understand? It is healthy to have this intellectual discourse, as you said at the top. So we are not being adversarial or personal. We're dealing with the issue as we should. Exactly. And it's okay that we disagree, because it's okay to disagree. People need to hear both sides of an argument and decide where they line up on it. We don't have to agree on everything, but we do have to agree on certain key issues. Now, the one point we did not get to as it relates to the reparations piece is the list of demands. For me, that deserves more attention than any effort to exclude African immigrants, but do nothing about Latinos, gays, and the white women's movement.
Well, Dr. Umar,
but we got to look at that list. We got to look at that list of demands.
Hold on, I want to get this point across. They're not included in our claim either. That's number one. Two, you mentioned a good point about tribalism. Understand that even when Black immigrants come to this country that was built on the back of Black Americans, I know you don't consider yourself that, they will start organizations only for them. Whereas Black Americans have no issues with that. But you do have to say they continue to
start organizations that include white folks.
And we start organizations that
include
our
those Black immigrants. Organizations. Everything we make it multicultural.
We start organizations
so let me get this straight. Let me get this straight. The African immigrant will start an organization for them. We will start an organization and bring white folks in it and dilute it and let everybody under the sun come in it. But it's a problem if they do an organization.
And that's the problem.
That's hypocrisy. That's a double standard.
We have been too all-inclusive, but the reparations claim, it was the Supreme Court ruling, can only be based on lineage. And by the way, you said Dr. Umar started rap. You know he didn't. And Marcus Garvey,
he's the father of hip hop, my brother. He's the father. He's recognized, universally recognized. He's the father.
Brown,
he's of Jamaican ancestry.
You have an issue with Africans. Father of hip hop.
You have an issue with Africans who are not born in America.
You are a tribalist, and you are part of the division
amongst African people.
I actually don't.
You have an issue with Africans not born in America.
What I have an issue with is what's happening right now.
And you are part of the
division right now is when people
I'm going to pray for you to grow past that.
Trying to capitalize off of Black Americans' gains and Black Americans' gains.
I'm going to pray for you to grow past that, my brother.
Umar,
don't be a tribalist. Don't be a divisionist.
I do want to give you
scapegoating African immigrants when you should be going at them Latinos.
Reparations is a lineage-based claim. Reparations is a lineage-based claim, and that is the way it has to be constitutionally. And from America, it has to go to those who are Black descendants of American slaves. It will not stand for Richard. But Dr. Umar, I want to give you the last word. I know you're starting your school. Is there any way people can support it? Please share with me.
Yes. We caught up in Donald Trump, Joe Biden. Donald Trump, Joe Biden. What has Donald Trump done for Black people? Nothing. What has Joe Biden done for Black people? Nothing. What did George Bush do for Black people? Nothing. What did Barack Obama do for Black people? Nothing. What did Bill Clinton do for Black people? Nothing. What did Bush Sr. do for Black people? Nothing. What did Ronald Reagan do for Black people? Nothing. What did Jimmy Carter do for Black people? Nothing. What did Gerald Ford do for Black people? Nothing. Nothing.